Hey everybody, welcome to Apply and Create. Today we're going to be talking about creating your first CSS Grid layout. If you want to learn more about me, check me out on Twitter and Instagram at jcook.mn, and you can also visit my website, jcook.me. Okay, so I'm going to be working in Atom. This is my code editor of choice. Feel free to use whatever you want. It's pretty basic. I just have my code over here, and then I'm using a package called Preview HTML, which is going to preview my document over here. And I just have a standard HTML document here, style tags, body, and in my body I have a couple section tags. This is what we're going to use to create our grid. Okay, so the first thing we want to do when we're going to create a grid layout is actually set the tag that we want to display grid. So you're going to use the display property and set it to grid. You might be familiar with things like display block or inline block, or even flex if you're familiar with flexbox. In this case we want to do display grid. This isn't really going to do anything. It's going to tell our web page that we want this to be displayed in CSS Grid, but there's no actually grid created yet. So we have to do a little bit of extra work. So what we're going to do is create the columns, because if you think of a grid, you have rows and columns, right? So we're going to start with columns. We're going to do grid, template, columns. And what we're going to do here is we're going to specify a series of values, and each value is going to describe one column in our grid. And you can use a couple different CSS units here. So you can do pixels, like you say 30 pixels, 60 pixels. And what this is going to say is create a 30 pixel column and a 60 pixel column. You can also do percentages like 30%, 30%, or what I tend to like to use is fraction units. So you can say 1FR, 1FR. So basically what this is going to say, this is like the equivalent of saying 50%, 50%. There are some nuances to this versus percentages, but for the most part this just means one fraction or one part, and we're going to have two of these, so it's going to be like two equal parts in our grid. You can of course create as many as you want, so we could have 3 columns, 4 columns. Then if you want to really spice up your layout, you can create larger or smaller parts. So you could actually have your last column be 4FR, or 4 parts. So this is actually going to be the equivalent of these 4 put together. For this example, we're just going to make a 3-column grid, and we're going to do the same with rows. When you're doing rows, it's the same exact notation here. So now we have our grid. There are 3 columns, there are 3 rows. You can't see that, of course, but they are indeed there. First, what we're going to do is we're going to create a couple elements. I'm going to create a heading 1 tag, say hello. Then we'll create heading 2, which says welcome to my grid. Okay, so you'll notice when I put in the H2, it automatically assigned itself to another column. So that's what's going to happen with CSS Grid, is if we don't specify a column or a row, it's just going to kind of go in order. Of course, if I made another tag, that would go into the 3rd column, and so on and so forth. If we want to change that, we can simply target that item or that element in our CSS. So we could say grid H1, and then we could just do grid column 2, and that'll move that one to the 2nd column. And then of course you can do this for row as well. So we could say grid row 2, and then that puts it down here on the 2nd row. Now what I like to do when I'm building a grid layout is wrap things even further. So I'm going to create a couple div tags. Now what I'm going to say up here, just so we can visually see what we're working with, I'm going to say all of our div tags, I want outline of 1 pixel solid black, just so we can see what they look like. And then we'll give some IDs. We'll say grid 1, and ID grid 2. So now we can just target that section basically and move things around as we need. So we could say grid 1, which has hello in it, we could say grid column 3, grid row 3, and move that over there. And then of course do the same thing for grid 2 and move that wherever we'd like. So we'll say 2 and 2. Now you're also going to run into instances where you're building a layout and you need to span columns or span rows, and that's pretty easy. All you need to do, we'll go to our first one, our hello over here, and let's say we want to span all 3 of the bottom columns. So what we're going to do is say, in our grid column, we're going to say 1, and then we're going to put a slash, and then we want this to run to the 3rd column, so we're actually going to add 1 to that number. We're going to say 1/4. So this is saying basically start at the first one and run up until you hit 4, which doesn't exist in this case, but that's basically saying, go 1 through 3 for your columns. And you can see it spans across 3 things here. And then, once you have your grid laid out, I mean, the options are endless. I just have some text in here. You can, of course, do other fun things. I could add in here a background. And this is how you're going to get really creative layouts in your web design or your web application. And of course, it can get even more complex than this. There are ways to sort of automate your grid layout, and you can use like the repeat function to create like a series of columns and rows. There are different sorts of differences in the syntax that you can use, but this is pretty much the basics of CSS Grid, and this can get you pretty far. I mean, you can do a lot with this, especially if you add in a media query. So I added in a media query here, and what we can do is we can say grid. So this is our section tag with the ID grid. We can say when it's below 600 pixels, change this to display block. Right, this is a common pattern that I might use, where I might have something that's 3 columns and it looks great on desktop, but for mobile I need to break things down so they just stack right on top of each other and I can get all the content inside the screen. Alternatively, you could keep that as a grid layout, but then just adjust your columns. So you could say grid template columns 1 FR 1 FR. So that way you're dealing with a less extensive grid, and of course you could keep this going and break it down with even more breakpoints. You could start with a 6-column grid, go down to 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and so on and so forth. Now, if you ever run into any issues with CSS Grid and you're looking for a way to just quickly remember what each thing does, I highly recommend going to grid.malvin.co. It is a super useful visual resource that just shows what each thing in CSS Grid does, especially when you run into things like justify items, align items, justify content, which we didn't cover here, but they provide more options on aligning things in your grid, and it can get kind of tricky with just how similar the words are. So they give you a really nice visual breakdown of what each thing is going to do. Then here, of course, is align content and some other things, and then it also breaks down into the things that you can apply to the children or the things within your grid. Alright, thanks so much for watching. If you liked this, go ahead and give it a like, and then of course feel free to subscribe. I wouldn't mind that at all, and I'll catch you next time.